Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Cricket8 Podcast. I'm one half of today's episode, National St. Patrick Hewitt, and to my left or to my right, depending on where you're looking, is, of course, the erstwhile Jarrod Kimber. We're back to discuss some more things in the world of cricket, and obviously in the last week, we've had yet more, ups and downs, tailspins, etc. But Jarrod, let's start with the one big match that has taken place in the last week, and the one that's captured at least the headlines for 48 and 72 hours, and then probably forgotten about, which is the Pakistan versus West Indies Test series. More so spoken about because West Indies pulled out an improbable victory from being 38 for 7 on day one of the second test to winning the test match by 120 runs. And it's hard, Jarrod, because I've talked about this on so many different platforms, including my own. And people are like, oh, aren't you happy? Aren't you excited? And I'm like, well, yeah, like West Indies rarely win. So yeah, I'm happy and I'm glad for them. And for 48 hours, I was on top of the world. And then the realization kind of kicked in that, but what does this mean? So that's where I'm going to start, Jarrod, because both teams finished last. Well, sorry. West Indies finished 8th, Pakistan finished 9th, but they're basically last. When two bottom sides play out a kind of chaotic classic, can you genuinely look at a result like that and say, good times are coming? I just don't think you can. In the there and the now you can, but I think once all the kind of euphoria's gone, I think you have to look at it and go, I'm not sure this is the harbinger of brilliance now for either side.
Well, I imagine what would have happened if we had promotion and relegation. That would have been the series, right? Like that's the thing. It's quite an entertaining series, all 8 minutes of it that were actually played. But it doesn't mean anything. And the whole idea of the World Test Championship, of course, is for it to mean more and for us to have more invested in it. I suppose it still means a little bit to both fan bases, I think it's probably fair to say. To Pakistan, they won 3 tests in a row at home, which, a year ago looked physically impossible for them as a cricket side. Even 6 months ago, maybe, looked physically impossible to be able to do that. So I think then losing that test against West Indies was quite a big thing. And for the West Indies to go over, probably also, let's be honest, without Rakim Cornwall, who was playing in the BPL or whatever he was at the time. Like, they didn't even have maybe their full strength side. They could have had an even better spinner available to them. And to be able to steal a test and draw a series, I think that's quite a big deal, right? Like, I think both of those things are very good and very important. The issue of how much it matters, I suppose, I'm not sure it matters any more or any less than the Australia-Sri Lanka series at the moment, which is also dead rubbers, right? Like, when it comes down to it, once you make something a league, you do actually take away one thing that Test cricket always had, which was that every individual series used to matter a little bit more, right? Once you make it a league, it's like, oh, it really matters, but it doesn't matter now because neither of these teams are going anywhere. So you want to give more context to the important stuff, and you give, like, maybe more people watch more Gavaskar Trophy, and I mean neutrals, because it was going to mean a lot. If you're in South Africa, you got to keep an eye on that. If you're in New Zealand, you had to keep an eye on that, right? Like, there are many other countries, Sri Lanka as well. But when it comes down to it, that also has the flip side of, like, suddenly you're in this situation where you've made it less important by putting a context on top of it, because at this stage, it really was something. I think for Pakistan fans, I'll throw to you at the end about the West Indies fans, but I think from a Pakistan fan's perspective, I did a big podcast after the first test, and I did this during the England series as well, going, the problem with what Pakistan is doing is that it will give them wins in a short period of time, but they can't control those wickets, right? They have to win the toss almost every time. They beat England once when they lost the toss, but England were not prepared for it. West Indies knew that they were going to Pakistan, the ball was going to rag, there were going to be moments where they weren't going to score any runs, but if they held in there, they had a chance of fighting back and winning, because they were going to be low-scoring, scrappy games, right? When England turned up, England were turned up for flat wickets and got a bit almost basballed, if you know what I mean. Like, it was like, how do you prepare for this? And my issue with Pakistan is that, and if Pakistan had just played the West Indies on 2 flat wickets, they probably just would have won the series 1-0, right? Like it would have been a very safe victory for them. So they made it really random. And because of that, the West Indies won a test. But as a West Indies fan, how do you sort of compartmentalize all of this?
On one hand, you look at it and you say, well, it's a bit of history making. Not many well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how well Pakistan barely play any test matches, but it'll be interesting to see over the next 2 to 3 years, assuming Pakistan stick with this. Well, who knows what Pakistan will do, but assuming they stick with this this trend of these wickets, it'll be interesting to see how many teams end up winning test matches in Pakistan. As a West Indian fan and follower of West Indian cricket, no one can turn their nose up at any win for West Indies. Even if it had been Zimbabwe away, you can't turn your nose up at a victory. Yeah. And particularly away from home. I think at home, it's easier to argue, okay, West Indies should maybe win a match, right? But away from home, you can't turn your nose up at any win. So it's a fantastic victory in that regard. Has it elevated anything? This is actually a difficult question, because when a pitch is so quote unquote poor, and I was asking Santoki this question the other day, when a pitch is so poor and then the batters come out of the series with like averages of 6 and 7 and things like that, are the batters bad, or where's the line then as to, oh, that was a pretty poor performance with the bat? Now, Craig Brathwaite hit a 50, Ali Cathanase hit a 50. I think Saud and Rizwan hit 50s on the other side. It was the type of pitch, Jarrod, where someone hitting a 30, you might have to say, oh, that's as good as hitting a 50 or whatever it might be. So I've come out of it going, are the batters bad? Which I think they are. But is that series the right series to judge whether they are or if they aren't? And the reason why it's so important to me, Jarrod, is obviously West Indies are about to undergo a coaching change. Darren Sammy's going to take over. There's all this talk about which white ball players will Darren Sammy now bring into the test squad and so on and so forth. But West Indies have now come off the back of a historic win in Pakistan, and the next team to turn up is Australia. And there'll be this weird line of, do we trust the guys that won in Pakistan? Similar to what happened last year. They trusted the guys that won in Australia at the Gabba, went to England, got trounced, right? So with Australia due to turn up in the Caribbean next, do you look at the Multan premium, the same way we looked at the Gabba premium, and say, we've got to trust these guys, we've got to go with them? Or do you look at the white ball squad and say, well, we got Brandon King there, we got Shea Hope there, we got Shafane Rutherford there. Can we convince any of them to come across and play Test cricket, which is the whole point of Darren Sammy becoming head coach? Where would you go on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember, and you might remember the year better than I will, but Australia toured West Indies at one stage, and the West Indies is probably the one tour that Australian fans just can't watch. Like, I think it starts at midnight and finishes at 7 or 8 in the morning, or whatever the time zones are. And so you, as an Australian fan, you basically just wake up the next day and find out what's happening. And I remember Ed Cowan said, he might have even said this publicly, but I'm sure he said it to me as well, where he said, it's really hard because it was a really low scoring series. And I think Kemar Roach took like 1 billion wickets, and the wickets were really hard to score on for both teams. And he's like, you average 30 in that series, and it's like averaging 45 to 50 in a normal series. He said, but you wake up and the journalists are like, oh, look, he's only made 35, right? Or, you know, he's only averaging 32 in this series. He's got to go. And he's like, I actually thought I had a really good series. You know, I can't remember what his average was. Maybe it was even lower than that. But so there is an element of how do you factor all that in? And you put in the wickets when it comes down to it, of, you know, at this level where you're just like, well, you can't really, like, what's the expected runs in an innings in this game? It's probably what, 170, 180?
Yeah.
Right? So if it's 170, 180, let's give 50 of those to the tail. Although I know in some cases the tail outperform themselves, but let's say the tail get that. So you're talking about the top 6 then, or top 7, maybe scoring 130 divided by 7. Now you started to go, well, no one, that means the expected average is what, 20, 25, right, of a batter in this series. So if you average 6, you're still a long way beneath that, right? But if you average 30, I think it's a fair question to be, in this series to go, well, then you're massively ahead of where you should be. And, we had it in the Border Gavasco series, which was another very low scoring series at time, right? And you look at Jaiswal, who I think averages 44. I think that's a really good average in a low scoring series. And I think you do have to factor those things in. The issue then becomes, I watched Brandon King in the, whoever he was playing for the other day in the SA20, right? Rob Barron, I can promise you this. I'm completely throwing Rob Barron under the bus. I'm not actually. I'm actually making him sound really good. But he said, "Get money on Brandon King bold here," right?
Right.
Like that means that Rob knows that Brandon King has a massive technical flaw within his game, and you and I have seen it as well, right?
Yeah.
The idea that Brandon King is going to come in and fix the batting issues within West Indies cricket is probably a little bit fanciful, isn't it?
Yep, agree.
It's not. This isn't the case of, remember that period where you had like, I don't know, Puran, Gale, I'm trying to think of who else was it, Hetmeyer, and you're going, well, all those guys can average around 40 in Test cricket, so let's just bring them all across, and that will make the team stronger than it is now. You're probably looking at just slightly different kinds of players. Having said that, if you look at the way they were trying to play this series, which was much more aggressive cricket, wouldn't they be better off picking the more aggressive options who are natural at it than the guys they're trying to make? They're trying to make a couple of guys there that I don't think being aggressive is their default. Like, I love Hodgie, but I can't see him really being the sort of dude who's going to come out and smoke a 70 ball 100 for them, right? Yeah. Like, they've got a lot of dour guys, and they seem to want to play more aggressive.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I kind of, some of the talk within kind of West Indian media and certainly amongst the fan base is, what is the philosophy of this side? And some of the critique is that you can't tell, like, so under Phil Simmons, the philosophy as we termed it was grind ball. And there's that famous series against England where Craig Brathwaite scored like 170 off like 500 balls or something like that, just grinding it out. It's been hard to work out what the philosophy is now. I think that's because the batters are so inexperienced. You can't even develop a philosophy because they're trying to learn just how to even play at the Test match level. And whereas with the current ODI squad, it's quite clear that Darren Sammy is trying to get them to be far more aggressive, because West Indies obviously have sucked at ODI cricket for the best part of 10 years. And Sammy's tried to at least instill some kind of philosophy as to how they go about their cricket in different phases of the game. So I'd have to believe that there is no way that Darren Sammy comes across into the Test squad and doesn't bring a philosophy with him as to what the West Indian brand of Test cricket is going to be. But you were saying something about, you were talking about the runs on pitches and how a 30 may be more. And I wrote down as you were talking XG. Now, there'll possibly be a level of naivety about what I'm about to say, but I am intrigued. Awesome. And I'm hoping that the audience is intrigued by it. In football, we have XG, expected goals. So, and I'm assuming you're familiar with the terminology. Cricket doesn't really use it as much. And don't get me wrong, football wasn't always like that. It's only in the last 5 years that XG has properly entered the footballing lexicon, where even the average punter talking after a football game will go, well, my team's XG was 3.2. Yeah, we only scored one goal, but we should have scored 3.2. So what does that say about the performance? Cricket, I'm sure the analysts are doing all that expected runs type thing, but it's not entered the fan lexicon, if you see what I mean. And I'm intrigued from your standpoint as an analyst who looks at things like the equivalent of expected runs or expected outs or whatever it might be. Why do you think it's taken so long for that to enter? Because it's not even on TV. It's not like you watch the TV comms and Ian Bishop is going, well, West Indies expected runs for this. I'm not talking about WinViz or anything like that where it says par score will be this. I'm talking about each individual batter expected runs was, I don't know, 42, but they only scored 20. Like, do you think we're not ready for that conversation?
I mean, I think we are. I don't know how much of the Border Gavaskar you saw, but like the Foxtel, the World Feed was quite progressive in some ways, right? Like, some of the stuff they're looking at, and you're seeing a lot of stuff about biomechanics now being shown on the screen, right? Like, I think there is a general move towards that. I think one of the issues is the only people doing expected average, is CricViz. And, that kind of limits it, right? Like you and I, you can't look it up at the end of a series.
Yeah.
What this is. And this has always been CricViz's biggest issue, right? And I've talked to them about it, so I'm not throwing them under the bus here. But their biggest issue has always been that they have these really cool toys, but they want to control everything, right? Like CricViz still don't have just a tool that you or I as a journalist can pay for, right? And get all of this kind of information from, right? Yeah. I'm not talking about even their fancy information. So they charge quite a lot if you want to get in, and I had some meetings with them this year. It's not money that, the Caribbean Cricket Podcast can afford. It's not money that the Good Areas Network can afford. Cricket8, maybe in the future, we'll look at it and go, okay, it's worth having a look at. But it's quite a lot of money. And so if you've got a commentator online, commentator on air, unless he happens to have he's working with CricViz that day and they've given him the number, well, he's not going to say it either, right? And so if you have a situation where that's not happening, that's very different than expected goals, from what I understand. Lots of people have data on that, right? Like, and it's the same with basketball, and baseball, and these other sports. A lot of the fans and the media have access to data, or can just pay a small fee and get access to really good information. So I think CricViz has kind of caused their issue, but they're also the progressive ones because they're the ones looking at that. I remember England. Do you remember when Joe Denley opened for England? Let's call back everyone. England put out, and they were right to do this, but it did not work. They were like, okay, so he averages 28 in Test cricket. But if you look at the bowlers he's faced and the deliveries he's faced, his expected average is lower than that. So he's actually overperformed what we think. Do you think the English media took that well, Nash? Right? Now, the truth is, I've done a lot of research. I've worked with CricViz quite a lot. We talk sport and other projects and everything. And I've had a look at their model's pretty spot on. Like, I remember there was talking about expected wickets. There was a ball that Tim Southey went out to in a test match, which was a full toss, 2 inches off the ground, a meter down leg side. And he somehow managed to get his bat under it, pick it up and hit backward square leg with it. And I was like, if expected average is right, that has to be like 300. All right. And I think it was like 450 or something, right? When they had a look at it. And so it does work, right, on that. But we aren't very mature in cricket to get to that kind of conversation. And I think a part of it is this sort of paywall or, firewall, whatever you want to look at, of CricViz doesn't really help, because it means everyone has to hire CricViz, right? And then you have to use CricViz correctly as well, which not everyone does. Lots of people, hire CricViz, and the Telegraph up until recently had a membership with CricViz. And it's like, well, most of the Telegraph writing didn't seem to be very CricVizzy. It was just Tim Wigmore occasionally, right? Like, maybe Will McPherson finding something. So I think what has to happen is, so a perfect example, in a T20 game, when a batter comes out, we should be able to say the average batter in this situation, right, will score this many runs off this many balls. We know that in every T20 game that comes out, and we can factor it in for location of grounds and all those sorts of things as well. We could, if we just started putting stuff like that up on the screen, it would fans would start to understand actually what was behind it. And I don't know, as I said before, in the Border Gavaskar Trophy, they did something very simple where every time two players were going up against each other, they put a matchup on the screen. Right? Do you remember what matchups were like? Even 2 years ago, do you remember how much people hated matchups? And suddenly Foxtel, not exactly, like quite an old school cricket network in many ways, suddenly Foxtel are putting it up on the screen. I was like, oh, finally, this is what we need, right?
Yes.
And that's where we need to go. And I think I can't remember if it was Foxtel or Channel 7 a couple of years ago, had the captaincy grid. Do you know what a captaincy grid is?
No, talk me through that one.
So most captains have them. I remember coming up with this idea and then finding out they already existed, was really upset. But essentially, a captain, quite often you see them get a piece of paper out of their pocket, and what they have in there is a captaincy grid. So it will have, let's say it has Craig Brathwaite, and it will have, right arm seam green, left arm seam red, you know, and it'll go through all the different kinds of bowling so that instantly they could see Brathwaite and let's say he's batting with Athanaze. They can be like, well, what's the best matchup for both of these guys combined at the moment? Okay, it's left arm finger spin. All right, you know, Jamal, warm up. You're coming on now because these two are going to be here, right? Or whatever pattern that you need. I think it was Channel 7 started putting those on the screen. Again, baby steps. These things have been around for about a decade now, right? And we're just starting to get to that kind of information. I actually think the expected averages on balls is wild, and cricket fans would absolutely love them. You know, when you see, you know, like Rohit Sharma does this all the time. He'll get a ball that takes the top of off stump, right? And the fans won't get it because they'll be like, well, wait a minute, why is he playing across the line when this ball's hitting the top of off stump? And it's because the angle of the bowler is angling it in and he thinks it's going to hit the top of leg stump. So he's playing towards mid-on and then the ball straightens. But to a human eye, it doesn't straighten that much, right? But if you're batting, if you think a ball's going to hit leg stump and it hits off stump, that has straightened a massive amount. And so when you look at the expected average, sometimes some of those balls that Rohit has been dismissed on, the expected average is like 0.5, 1.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That then tells you your eye is misunderstanding this. The geometry of the game has meant that you can't see it. We see it all the time. Adil Rashid bowled one against India the other day. You know, Alana King bowled some balls. When it spins massively, we can work that out. We don't need expected average, right? But when it's an angles thing, like Akshar Patel, right? Or Jamal Warrikan and some of those dismissals that he got against Pakistan, sometimes you're like, well, actually, that ball hasn't spun that much. And you're like, but it has, considering the angle that it's been bowled from. We as humans can start to understand that there are things that we can't see, but it needs to be baby stepped. But I think the other issue is that we don't have enough, I don't know, adults in the room is the wrong way of putting it, but we don't have enough people who get it, because a lot of the ex-players are like, we understand cricket. We don't need...
Exactly. That's exactly where I was going to go next. Yeah, that's exactly... Yeah. It feels like the conversation... What we're talking about feels like what the conversation was prior to, I guess, even any kind of data coming into the T20 game about, 5-6 years ago, and people still talking about the T20 game like it. People are commentating on T20 games 5-6 years ago, like it's the same way they commentate on Test cricket. And it was only it's only in the 5-6 years, 5-6 years later now, that they realize it's actually more scientific in terms of what you actually have to talk about.
Well, if you go back, you look at people like Mike Atherton, who would say things like, it's impossible to write a good article from a T20 game. And it's like, well, it's not, Athers. It's impossible to write it the way you write it because you're trained on how to write Test cricket. That's not having a go at him. He's obviously very good at that. But he hadn't thought in his mind that he had to retrain himself and come up with a new angle for a T20 game, right? And so it's the same with commentary, yeah? And what kind of T20 commentary did we get? We get Bumble, Start the Car. We get Danny Morrison. We get Michael Slater. We get, Graham Swan. We get that sort of excitable stuff, which is fine. But that's one niche of T20 cricket. There's also Ian Bishop and Simon Doull talking about matchups, right? And other information.
But thing is, we were supposed to start talking. This was supposed to be about Pakistan, West Indies. Before we go to a break, people, I'm going to give Jarrod one last bit on this, because actually, maybe this is something wrong with sports in general. So maybe we'll say it's specific to cricket. Because football has this. A lot of the people who get into comms, or I guess just media around sports, tend to be ex-players. Right. And that's no disrespect to any of the ex-players, but it's weird because when you think about it, if I truly want to understand what's going on from a tactical point of view in T20 cricket, we actually need an analyst talking on screen, but we've not got there yet, right? We've not. And football, I've realized that football has only just, for me, in the last 3-4 years got to a point where they realized, no, I need a journalist talking to me about what's actually going on. I don't need an ex-player who's played the game telling me, well, and don't get me wrong, sometimes ex-players bring some key stuff that we wouldn't understand. But why do you, I think cricket's slow to it, that we're not even at a point yet where we'd accept, well, whoever that, okay, let's put you in it. We're not at a point where an audience would accept, let's say it's England versus whoever, right? And live in the studio, it's Jarrod Kimber, Tim Wigmore, and Zoltz or something, people would be like, "What the hell? Who are these guys? Who are these guys? What do they know about cricket? Why do you think we're not there yet?"
So something happened with cricket where we just went so hard towards former players commentating in a way that I'm not sure any other sport completely did. I mean, I'd have to go through, but I watch a lot of NBA, and there's usually a journalist or a professional broadcaster on with those games. And when I watch other sports, the person who calls the sport is generally a professional broadcaster or a journalist, right? Like those are the skills they have. We used to be like that in cricket. In fact, if you wanted to be an ex-player in cricket, your best way to get into broadcasting was to be a journalist, right? Richie Benaud and even Ian Chappell, both of those guys were trained. Sunil Gavaskar wrote his own columns, right? Like didn't have a ghostwriter, wrote his own columns. So what happened to that? How do we go from that to people commentating who've never commentated before, haven't been trained how to commentate, and aren't particularly good at it, getting regular jobs, right? So that is down to production and producers around the world, and quite often TV owners and, it's the higher ups rather than just the producers. And we've ended up with not the best system that we should have, right? Like I'm being as friendly as I can be here, but we've ended up with not the best system that we have. And I did a podcast with Bumble the other day, and he was saying you have to have a journalist on and an ex-player. Right. Whereas I don't mind if it's 2 ex-players and 2 journalists, but throughout the course of the day, you should have that combination, right? That's how you should be looking at your broadcast. I think with TV specifically, we've come to a point, and this actually comes right back to the West Indies. So the West Indies were first to do this. The West Indies didn't want Cozier or Holding. The West Indies Cricket Board did not want Cozier or Holding on air because they would say things that was not pro West Indies Cricket Board thoughts, right? They were the first board that I'm aware of that went out of their way to do that. And quite often I've been sounded out for jobs by companies. And then later the job offers have been rescinded because they're like, we can't put you can't, the Cricket Board's like, you can't put Jarrod Kimber on air. He's going to say this, right? Yeah. It's like, well, that's what you should want. You should, and if you go back to the old Channel 9 days, even when Channel 9 and Cricket Australia were intertwined, right? Like Kerry Packer was like, he was almost a part of Cricket Australia. They were still really full on with things that they said on air, quite often against Cricket Australia shouldn't be doing this and Cricket Australia shouldn't be doing that. I can't imagine many broadcasters ever doing that again, right? And cricket's gone so far to that direction, whereas other sports seem to have still got that sort of healthy bit of journalism, whatever you want to call it, broadcasting within it. Whereas in cricket, we just seem to have stuffed it up. So we're missing lots of things within cricket that we could be covering quite easily just because we are putting the wrong people on air. The amount of times, Mash, I am told, oh, wow, you're so brave. I had someone within cricket yesterday give me a call out of the blue. Go, oh, mate, you're so brave doing what you did with the Bangladesh Premier League. I can't believe
I'm surprised you're still here, to be honest.
And I was like, is it brave to point out that it's very rare to have 3 wides bowled in the 10th over of a game, right? And then that the betting markets seem to just suggest that a lot of runs were about to come. How have we got here, Mash? How have we got to this point, right? There's an NBA player at the moment, Terry Rozier, who's just been, they're having a look into him because in a game he usually played 30 minutes a game and scored 20 points a game. And there was one particular game where he played for 5 minutes, went off sore, and everyone bet beforehand that he was going to have a bad game, right? That's all the information that the NBA have, is that he usually played a lot more minutes, right? And that there was a betting market. And the NBA are willing to go to Terry Rozier. And in cricket, if the same thing happens, no one will even talk about it, right? And go back and have a listen to the commentary of those overs in the BPL I talked about. Listen to Curtly Ambrose. There's a moment, I didn't put it in the final piece, but there's a moment where someone, the co-commentator says to Curtly, you would have bowled a wide like that. And Curtly's like, I've never bowled a wide like that, right? And it's his way of saying he was more accurate than this guy, but also suggesting that is not a normal wide, right? Yeah. And that is as close as we will ever get. Remember, Michael Holding did it with the Amir no ball as well. Yes. Right? That is as close as we ever get to just saying there's something wrong here. We need to take a look at it. So the entire sport in that way is a little bit broken.
Listen, we're going to take a break, Jarrod, and on the other side, we're going to have a quick conversation about Steve Smith. So join us on the other side, people.
If you come to cricket8.com now, you can spin the wheel as we start to launch a new thing for us, our free fun cricket games. There are prizes for top spinners, and on top of all that, we have 8,000 live scorecards and so much content.
Right, we are back, and we're going to just, before we wrap up today's show, just going to have a quick yarn about Steve Smith. He's created a bit of history in the current ongoing test match between Australia and Sri Lanka, and I can't think of anyone better placed really to talk about Steve Smith. Obviously, the story for those who, if you've been sitting under a bed or something, Steve Smith did not start out as everyone knowing him as a champion batter, and yet here we are now as he's 35 years old. Is it the fourth fastest? I can't remember where in the list he was. I think it was fourth fastest to 10,000. Is that what it was?
Is that in years or is that in games?
I think it was in games. I'm going to find the stat in a minute.
Yeah.
But I think we'll just start here, Jarrod. In the pantheon of research that you've done, or even just in the modern day context, where do you place Steve Smith? And funnily enough, obviously because of the scandal and so on and so forth, do you think he's still a bit underappreciated? Or do you think he's exactly where he belongs in the kind of conclusion of his career and what he's achieved?
I think that if you compare him to Lara or Tendulkar or even Ponting, Kohli, you could throw in there as well. They're just all better to watch. And so I think there's always an element of that, right? Like, say whatever. It's really funny when you go back through the history of great batters, and it's like, there's a guy called Clem Hill who played for Australia when Victor Trumper did. His numbers are almost identical to Victor Trumper's, right? Like, he's a little bit slower with his strike rate, but more or less a very similar level bat. No one has mentioned Clem Hill out loud outside of me in the last, 7 weeks, right? Whereas Victor Trumper, anywhere you go, there's an old cricket fan go, oh, I never watched him play, but if you read this, do you know what I mean? Aesthetics matter. And we it's why Yunus Khan, for everything he did, is probably not going to be remembered quite in the same way that Inzi is, even if Yunus Khan is probably a slightly better batter than Inzi, right? Like, all things considered. So I think there's always that element. There's also the ball tampering. In fact, so I released an article today about Smith versus Sachin, to see who, basically, they're the two players mentioned the most as best since Bradman. And I got an email straight away from a very angry English fan going, well, you haven't even mentioned the ball tampering. And I was like, well, what's the ball tampering got to do with how good he is at batting, right? And so I think that there's, if it was Shoaib Akhtar or Shane Warne, who both got caught with, masking agents or performance-enhancing drugs, I'll be like, I think that should be mentioned in their records. But his batting has nothing to do with that. So I think there's an element of the ball tampering. And there's an element of he's not particularly fun to watch. Like, he's just not until he goes nuts and he starts playing. Have you ever seen that shot he played off Wahab Riaz in the 2016 World Cup, where the ball's literally being bowled off the pitch and he hits it to the leg side? Until he gets to that point, it's kind of just him nudging the backward square leg over and over again, isn't it? Right? That's like 90% of our memory is he's had a ball bowled outside a stump and it's gone to backward square leg. But I also think that the story is amazing when, as you said, no one thought he was going to be a champion cricketer. So he was a good underage batter, a great underage batter, but he makes his debut. And I was there for his second test. I think I'm right in saying it was his second test against Pakistan in England, right? Before they moved to the UAE for their neutral tests. And he made 77 batting at number 8 or 9. In fact, he mentions he batted number 9 in that series, and I looked it up. They just had a night watch ahead of him. Like, it's funny how it's like the Michael Jordan thing of like, how dare you bat me at number 9? I'm Steve Smith. And it's like, well, you were at 8, and then Mitchell Johnson went up ahead of you in one innings, right? But he made 77, and there was about 8 of us, mate, in the press conference. It was, we were in Headingley. I remember Bryden Coverdale was there. There was a couple of other Australian journalists. There was like one Pakistani journalist and one like English journalist in the room. And we asked Ricky Ponting, I can't remember if it was me or Bryden, was like, okay, he's now made 77. You guys picked him as a bowler. We all know he's a batter. Do you think he can even play? Can he ever bat in the top 6 for Australia? And Ricky Ponting was like, no. To go from that to a better batter than Ricky Ponting is one of the most incredible things. And it tells you about outsiders and non-conformity, that we have a real trouble and just looking at that. And my favorite thing in cricket is that we have Don Bradman, Murali, and Jeff Thompson, right? 3 incredible outliers, and no one ever did what they did again. Like, no, if you go back and watch Don Bradman, like there was that thing about Don Bradman. Oh, when I watch Sachin Tendulkar, he bats like me. Don Bradman didn't bat like Sachin Tendulkar. Like Sachin Tendulkar was a beautiful textbook. Don Bradman wasn't a beautiful textbook. He just invented his own version of batting. Jeff Thompson, fastest bowler we've ever seen compared to other bowlers in his era. There's no one ever been that much faster than everyone else in his era. When's the next Jeff Thompson accent we've ever seen? No one's ever come in and bowled like Jeff Thompson before. And Murali, for the same thing. Right. And so we see this time and time again in cricket. And yet it is the outliers who end up with the freakish records. And Smith is there. You ask me where he ends up. I think I still have him just outside. I can make a case. Bradman's obviously the best test batter of all time, I would say. It'd be very hard to make a case he's not. I think you can make a case that Sachin has an argument to be the best test batter of all time. Right. I don't think you have that case with Smith right now. Now, having said that, he's made 300s in the last couple of weeks. If he goes on another run of averaging 50 and 60 in Test cricket for another 5 years, then we have to, change the way we think about that. But at the moment, I think he's in that tier just below, which would put him in where I would say you would have guys like Gavaskar, Viv Richards, Len Hutton. I think that's where Smith is at the moment. Had he continued on the same, if he not got hit by Jofra Archer, if people hadn't found a way to slow him down a little bit with scoring, I think then you have a case for him being at that Sachin level. But I think he's just marginally below that tier of having a case of being the best batter of all time.
So that leaves me to really points to look at them. So just to give the stats though, so when I said fourth, it's actually fifth. So fewest innings needed to get to 10,000 test runs. Lara and Sachin are 195. In fact, no, Lara, Sachin, and Kumar Sangakkara are 195. Ricky's 196, and Steve Smith is 205. So yeah, technically fourth. But
bit slack.
But he's 35 now. Two things actually that come to mind about this. One, why do you think he went on what to me looked like a vanity project to open when that would have? Does it say that, was he bored? Or because at this point I'm thinking about, does he want to chase different records? He's got about what? Australian batters can play to what? Kawaja's age. So maybe he's got 3 more years. I don't if he's got the desire to play at the top level for 3 more years. Why do you think he had that momentary, let me just go and open? And do you think over the last 3 years of his career, if he plays that long, that he will be thinking about how many records can I break?
I don't think he thinks about records. I do think he probably is starting to think about legacy a little bit. Maybe not in the way that someone like Virat Kohli thought about legacy, the way that Michael Clarke thought about legacy. But I think there's a part of him who's just like, I actually have a chance now of pushing myself up to be, I mean, when he retires, the question is going to be, is he better than Sachin? Right? Yeah. Like, should he be in the top 3-4 batters of all time? And he was on target for that for ages and just slipped back slightly in that period. And I think that's why he opened. I think he opened to say, imagine I can do this as well. But I also think he opened because he was in a funk. He wasn't scoring the kinds of runs that he wanted to. And he doesn't think about cricket the way that you or I do, Mash. Right? He's just like, oh, maybe if I open, I can overcome this, and this problem about my backlift, and the hard ball will come on and everything else. It just didn't work for him. He's gone back to number 4, and he's finally found the form that he was probably looking for. So it's worked from that point of view. But look, he is a weird dude. I don't think he thinks about cricket or life the way that the rest of us do. If he retired tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but after the World Test Championship final, I'd be like, I get that. If he retired when he was 42, I'd be like, I get that. Like, he's just going to coach, right? He's not going to commentate. He's going to go straight into coaching. So it's up to him whether he thinks he can make runs. But I do think there's a bit of a legacy thing. I think he probably in his mind thinks he's missing quite a few runs, right? And that's a very important thing for him. So look, he's a fantastic cricketer. I know we both need to go, but there's a really interesting question I want to bring up here about the pitch. From West Indies, Pakistan. So Simple Math says, will the ICC rate the pitch poor, or is it okay for Pakistan to produce turners? Rules apply to Indian turning wickets, I guess. So India have, since 2022, not been penalised. They've only been penalised for 1 wicket, which was the Chinnaswamy one against Sri Lanka. So their turning wickets have not been penalised. Pakistan has been penalised 3 times. One of those was overturned, but for 2 other occasions for having very flat wickets. It would be incredibly Pakistan to, within the space of 2 years, to get penalised for a wicket for being too weighted towards batters, and then to try and fix that and to make it so too weighted towards bowlers, right? I do think some of those wickets in that game, I think we have to start having adult conversations with India, South Africa, and Pakistan. I've been like, we're okay with you making wickets that suit your home players, right? But there's a difference between that and a wicket where the match is just completely almost random because of what you've done. That's the adult conversation to be having with some of these. Some of the balls were spinning like 10 and 12 degrees in those games, right? Like, I think we have the data to be able to say that is a little bit too much, right? And the same with I think the SCG pitch did very well. I think it was just below par. I think that was lucky to get away with it. We have the data now. We don't have to go on, this team was bowled out for 170 and this team was bowled out for 220. We can bring it all back for MASH, expected average, right? And we can look at consistency of bounce, consistency of turn, consistency of seam, all these sorts of things, and be like, well, this wicket clearly wasn't, was it the SCG one on the first day and a half where it was like, you didn't know if the ball was going to bounce up or stay low. Yeah. That to me is an unfit wicket at international level. If it has extra bounce, fine. If it has extra spin, fine. But if you're not sure if the ball is going to bounce or not bounce, whether you're playing spin or pace, that's just a random wicket for no reason. That is the sort of thing we can tell in data. So it'd be really interesting. But yeah, India weren't penalised for a lot of their spinning wickets. So it would be hilarious if somehow Pakistan get themselves penalised for one of these after fighting. Also, as I said before, they actually fought one of their penalties. They fought because they said, yeah, it's a flat pitch, but that's okay. Hawkeye data says it's fine.
Well, listen, ladies and gents, if you joined us live and you threw some comments in, thank you very much. If you're watching this on the replay, don't hesitate to also comment below. Cricket8, we're the home of robust conversations about cricket and so much more. Stay tuned and locked in for more content coming in the next few days and weeks, and we'll see you very, very soon.
Remember to support us by subscribing and sharing, but also signing up at cricket8.com, where live scorecards cover 8,000 matches a year with advanced visual details that tell you who is actually in front in the game.